friends, it's Juliana Michaels, and welcome back for part 3 of my junk journal journey. If you've missed the other two, you can find them linked down below, and I've also created a junk journal journey playlist. During my junk journal journey, I took some time to make lots of bits and bobs to put into my journal. This included tickets and other ephemera created using a mix of stamps and dies. While I know a traditional junk journal uses actual recycled items, this journey for me is more about the process of using the products and supplies I have. If you want to check out any of the supplies I'm using, I'll have them linked down below. Using those links helps support me, so I really appreciate it. First up, I want to share with you how I created these tickets. To create these tickets, I'm using the Tim Holtz ticket booth stamp set. There is also a coordinating die set, but you could easily cut these out with scissors. For the tickets, I'm going to use a variety of colors from various scrapbook.com paper pads, including roses, neutrals, cools, boho, and Christmas. The colors, along with the smooth surface, are perfect for the look I was going for. Feel free to dig through your own stash to find papers and colors you want to work with. Off camera, I stamped the images using archival ink and black soot and die cut them using the coordinating dies. Here I'm going to share with you how I distressed the tickets to give them a touch of vintage flair. The first thing I did was take a Ranger sanding disc and use it to sand the edges and random sections of the ticket. When working with a sanding disc, you could also use sandpaper. Just make sure to protect your work surface. Here I'm working on an insert from a piece of packaging to protect mine. After I finish sanding the ticket, I'm going to ink the edges and the other areas I sanded with walnut stained distress ink using a foam blending tool. Next, I'm splattering a bit of water onto the ticket to activate the ink and then drying it with my heat tool. Here you can see more of the tickets I created and put into this pocket I made, and I'm going to share how I created it next. On this pocket, I used the Tim Holtz post-style die set to create the special delivery label. It is die cut from black craft stock, which is a craft paper printed on one side with black ink. I put a piece of mint tape on the back side of the die to hold the letters in place and then sanded over it to reveal the craft colored core of this paper, and then adhered it to the pocket. Now I'm going to share with you how I created the pocket. I use these scrapbook.com tall skinny pocket dies, and I'm going to share a trick with you on how to make them into short pockets. To do this, I'm placing the bottom of the pocket die onto a piece of paper that is slightly larger than the pocket I want to create. I then run it through my die cutting machine. But as you can see, part of the die is hanging over the paper. Next, I place the top of the pocket die on the paper to create a pocket the size I want. As you can see here, you can control how tall or short the pocket is just by where you place the top of the die. I then used a piece of mint tape to hold the die in place and ran it through my die cutting machine. The most important part here, though, is to just run it part way through the die cutting machine so that it only cuts the top part of the die. I then remove the die cut, fold the edges, and voila, I have a short pocket the exact size I want. Now onto the ephemera I created. I used a variety of dies, including the Tim Holtz Postal, collector, specimens, and labels. Off camera, I die cut a bunch of the shapes from Distress Heavy stock. I also used the Vintage Labels dies as a layer on some of them, and I die cut those from black craft stock. To give the paper a more vintage feel, I smushed my old paper distress ink pad onto my craft mat and spritzed it with some water. I then took the die cuts and smushed them into the ink. I used my heat tool to dry the ink, but you could also just ink smush the entire batch of die cuts and lay them to the side to dry. One of the embellishments I used on the ephemera I created are insects from the Tim Holtz Entomology stamp set. This set also has coordinating dies, but if you don't have them, you can also fussy cut the insects. I would just not worry about cutting around the antenna to save yourself a little bit of time and frustration. As for the vintage labels, I die cut those from black craft stock and sanded over them to reveal the craft core and add some interest. After I had ink smushed all of the die cuts, I went on to the stamping. I used a mix of Tim Holtz stamps, including illustrated garden and field notes. Here I'm placing the die cut onto my stamping platform and using scrapbook.com dotted tape runner, which is a temporary adhesive, to hold them in place. I then stamped the various images using black soot archival ink. Here I only wanted part of a stamped image, so I used my fingers to hold the stamp and just push down on the part I wanted to stamp. To add the splatters, I cheated and used this stamp set from the Tim Holtz Examination stamp set. If splatters aren't your thing, this stamp is perfect for creating them. When I do this, I prefer to stamp with a stamping block since I'm going to be repeating the splatters here and there on the paper. To stamp the image, I'm using archival ink and frayed burlap, but feel free to use any color you like or that coordinates with the colors you are using for your journal. With the stamping completed, I remove the die cut from my stamping platform and rub off the temporary adhesive with my finger. I then ink the edges with walnut stained distress ink. I repeat this process of stamping on all of the die cuts until the pile is completed. Now I'm going to show you how I created this specimen slide. This was die cut using the Tim Holtz specimen die set, and I have already ink smushed it into old paper distress ink and dried it. Here I'm adding some stamp detail using a mix of stamps and once again stamping with archival ink. Once the stamping was completed, it was time to select an insect to place inside. Here I'm checking the sizes of the various insects from the Entomology stamp set against the opening on the slide die, and I settle on the ladybug. As I mentioned earlier, I have the coordinating dies for this stamp set, but if you don't, I want to show you how you can use the stamps and not make yourself crazy with fussy cutting. I stamped the ladybug onto a piece of distress heavy stock and then color the ladybug using a distress watercolor pencil, an aged mahogany, and a water brush. Next, I stamped the ladybug a second time onto the negative piece of distress heavy stock that was from the slide die when I cut it earlier. Here I'm fussy cutting just the body of the ladybug so I don't have to try to cut out those tiny legs and antenna. This just adds a little extra dimension to the insect, and if you wanted, you could adhere this layer with some double-sided foam adhesive. However, since this is going inside the slide, I adhered it with a tape runner. I then inked the edges of this piece with some walnut stained distress ink. The next step is to cover the opening on the slide with acetate to give it the look of being behind glass. I cut this to just slightly larger than the opening and used super tape to adhere it in place. Next, I inked the edges of the slide piece with walnut stained distress ink. I then adhere the insect inside and close up the slide using super tape. The label here is die cut from black craft stock using the specimen die set. Off camera, I die cut the label shape from distress heavy stock and from black craft stock. I then took the black one and die cut it with the collect word. Here I'm punching out the letters and adhering the black one on top of the heavy stock one. I then adhere the inside of the O, but you could certainly skip doing this. I then did a bit of distressing by sanding the label using a sanding disc, which, as I mentioned earlier, you can also use a piece of sandpaper to get the same effect. The finishing touch is the addition of some tiny brads. Here I'm using my scissors to trim off the excess end of the brad. I then adhere the label to the slide using super tape. Next, I'm going to share how I created this large specimen folder. I'll be working with the Tim Holtz Illustrated Garden, Field Notes, Examination, Bird Feather, and On the Farm stamp sets. The dies I'm using is this large die from the Elizabeth Craft Designs Photo Film Slides die set and the Tim Holtz Collector and Post-Style die sets. Off camera, I die cut the various pieces. I cut a piece of Tim Holtz Ideology pattern paper using the large slide die. I cut it out with the second piece of pattern paper and cut that in half. I'm going to adhere the half without the opening to the inside of the folder, and I'll share more about that here in a bit. On this piece, I stamped images from the Tim Holtz Moth Study and Bird Feather stamp sets using black soot archival ink. This rectangular piece is going on the front of the folder. I had also die cut the folder from a piece of distress heavy stock and saved this inside window piece and stamped it with a moth and figure number. I also stamped the same 4 moths onto another piece of distress heavy stock, and I'll show you what I'm going to do with them here shortly. Here I'm picking out and stamping some images onto this rectangle die cut using Black Soot Archival ink. I then add some faux splatters with a stamp from the examination stamp set using frayed burlap. Here I'm stamping onto a tab die cut and creating another element to embellish the folder. The pointy finger is cut from black craft stock for the top layer and distress heavy stock for the bottom. Here I'm using the sanding disc to distress the black paper before adhering the layers together using distress collage medium. I forgot to distress the distress heavy stock with old paper ink, so I applied some of the ink directly to the paper and then used a water brush to blend it around a bit and set it to the side to dry. This is the extra piece of distress heavy stock with all 4 moths stamped on it. I'm going to color them in using distress watercolor pencils in Vintage Photo, Rusty Hinge, Wild Honey, Black Soot, Antique Linen, Walnut Stain, Frayed Burlap, and Fossilized Amber. Here I'm using my preferred method for working with these pencils, and that is to pull the color off of the pencil using a water brush. As I go along, I tap off excess color either onto the craft mat or the paper towel, and of course, clean off the brush in between colors. Once I'm finished coloring the images, I'm going to fussy cut them out, but only the body and wings. I'm not going to worry about the antenna. Next up, I'm taking the piece that will go inside the folder and rounding the corners using this We Are Makers corner punch. I then ink the edges with walnut stain distress ink. While I'm at it, I go ahead and ink the edges on the rest of the die cuts. Here I'm adhering the fussy cut moths on top of their corresponding images. By doing it this way, you will get the antenna part without having to fussy cut them, and you can get a little dimension with a second layer. Because these are going inside the folder, I'm just using Distress Collage Medium to adhere them together, but you could also use foam adhesive to get a lot more dimension. Now I'm going to place a piece of acetate on the back side of the opening just like I did for the specimen slide and adhere it with super tape. I then place the moth inside the opening, making sure the stamped image is facing out. I'm going to cover this with the extra pattern paper I cut in half from the large slide die. Here I'm just inking the edges of that piece of paper. I then adhere it using an adhesive tape runner, but before I adhere the top part, I place the moth piece in position and then finish applying the adhesive. Next up, I'm adhering the various bits to the front of the folder. Thankfully, I hadn't done a great job adhering these pieces together, so I was able to stick this tab in between them. I also decided to add some stamping on the back side of the tag. On the inside of the folder, I adhere the moth piece. I also decide to add some stamp detail using the ledger image from On the Farm stamp set. And truth be told, that image was the main reason I got that stamp set. Here I'm stamping another label from the Field Notes stamp set and cutting it out to use on the inside of the tag. I then finish it all off by inking the edges with walnut stain distress ink. Here's a look at the finished large specimen folder, and I must say I kind of love how it turned out. So there you have it, a look at how I created some of the bits and bobs that I end up using in my journal. Thanks so much for stopping by and watching today's video. Next, I'll be sharing a flip through of the completed journal, so stay tuned. Thanks so much for watching. I'm truly grateful for you. I was wondering if you could do me a quick favor and subscribe to my channel or leave me a thumbs up or a comment. If you're feeling extra generous, I'd love for you to share about my channel with your friends. All of these things help out us YouTubers so much, and it would mean so much to me to have your support.